Well, welcome to Office Hours 39. I'm Peter Bull. I'm here with Adam Mitchell. Adam has been a student of China for many years since I've known him when he was an undergraduate. He's now actually finishing his master's thesis in which he writes about the beggars of Xi'an.
Right.
And where you also have a photo exhibit that you've done here at Harvard, right?
Right, yep.
A very depressing but interesting exhibit. There were some questions, and one of the questions was, if you want to submit questions, where do you do it? And for those of you who are new, and we're so happy that some of you are new to the course at this point, you can submit questions at the bottom of the form. You see it on your screen. The bottom of the form, there's a place in the weekly survey to submit questions. We had lots of questions, and we can't answer all of them. Some of them will be answered eventually in later lectures. But Adam, let me, since you're the modern historian now, let me ask you some of them. One of the learners asks, Professor Kirby hasn't said much about what's happened outside of China, but was China really isolated in all these developments it was going through in the 1950s?
I mean, absolutely not. It was extremely connected internationally, especially to the socialist world. It had very strong ties with Russia. It was importing lots of machinery, foreign expertise to build up its industrial complex. You see a lot of grain and aid being exported to places like Albania. Silver bullion was actually being exported to England at this time. They were buying foreign currency with silver.
Oh, really?
Things like that, yeah.
So do you have a sense, though, of another question, which is, to what extent were political developments in China, and we'll be talking about the 100 Flowers campaign today, to what extent were those influenced by outside developments?
And they were extremely influenced. So China was very politically attuned to what was happening in the rest, like especially the socialist world.
Somebody writes they'd like to know more about the everyday life of the people during this period. This is an interesting question because we very often get asked what were the lives that people like. And it's often very hard to know, given our sources, what the vast majority of people's lives were like, except we know that the vast majority were on the farm. Can you say anything about this?
Yeah, so people's lives differed greatly from region to region, of course, but in general, so in 1955 and 56, China experienced what was later called the socialist high tide, and this was a period of intense collectivization. So farms were deprivatized. They were put together into groups called cooperatives or collectives. Farmers were encouraged to pool resources, agricultural implements, farm animals, beast of burden, different things like that. And they were encouraged to farm plots of lands together, in theory, to increase productivity. And actually, in some ways, this first stage of collectivization was relatively successful. Farmers were able to pool capital, and it did increase the livelihoods of some individuals. So this was the first major period of collectivization, which would kind of stage the way for the much, much deeper and more fundamental collectivization and communization, which happened.
And those later stages were not successful.
They were not successful at all.
Another question that we get is, speaking about the 100 Flowers campaign, to what extent was Mao able to control it?
Well, he wasn't. He wasn't able to control it. He was very good at starting campaigns, not necessarily good at guiding them through. But what he did was, he unleashed this intellectual campaign on China. He received the criticism that he wanted. He wanted people to attack certain elements of the bureaucracy, and he also received far more criticism than he had anticipated. Ultimately, he cracked down on it very hard. But yeah, he didn't really control the movement. He let it take its course. It lasted for 5 weeks, and then there was a very severe...
Well, he seems to have been able to begin it, but also to end it.
Yeah, he did end it. He did end it. But I don't know that he controlled the campaign.
I don't know. For me, controlling, if you can begin something and end something, ending is hard.
Yeah, that's true. Right? That's true.
So another question. Mao picking up the banner of Stalinism. Did he really think he was the only person who could truly lead the socialist nation into creating a true socialist world?
Well, he definitely saw himself as the rightful successor. I mean, all over China, even today, you'll see pictures everywhere of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. And you see the 4 heads put on a flag. He saw himself as the direct descendant in this lineage of Marxist intellectuals. When Stalin died and Gorbachev took over, Gorbachev denounced Stalin, denounces Stalin in the secret speech, and Mao sees that as a threat to himself. And Mao sees himself truly as the inheritor to lead the socialist world, and he tries all kinds of things to put China at the forefront to lead. So we asked our learners, what are your thoughts of the account of the nameless individual from the book Mao's People by Michael Froelich. What were some of the things our learners said?
So this nameless individual was a person who was, in a sense, betrayed by his mentor and by his girlfriend.
Right.
So total betrayal, so to speak, right? And pays a price.
And pays a big price.
And is innocent. And Paul Handel says, Orwell's 1984. It's a world where people inform on each other very much. Thilo Flasch sends in a cartoon he saw many years ago from the German Democratic Republic, and you see it now on your screen. And this is really the notion of an individual who can be honest and straightforward, and they keep getting, sometimes they're in trouble, sometimes not, because the party line keeps shifting back and forth. And it does seem to me that if you were in China and had a position and were consistent, sometimes you'd be on the right side and sometimes on the wrong side.
Right.
What the party really wanted, and I think Lao Bida recognizes this, is it wants people to go along with it, to follow its lead. And he sees these themes, he says, of self-criticism and personal betrayal in works like Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, and Orwell's Animal Farm, and so on. So in some sense, he's looking at this in the context of a kind of 20th century fiction. Even Kilma's My Crazy Century, Ji Jiang's Red Scarf Girl, and so on. Right? Ronald Rea has a little entry called How to Succeed in a One-Party State. And here he makes the point that the most important skill to be successful was to be politically astute, which I think means you got to know which way the wind's blowing. Right. The problem is, if the wind is blowing in a predictable fashion, it's easy to go with the wind, to bend with the wind. But if it's not predictable, what do you do?
Right. And actually in the story we found that the nameless individual, watched his mentor to see how his mentor responded to these changing winds, and he would follow his direction. Well, it turns out by following his mentor, he became an easy target, easy person to shift the blame to.
So in the end, maybe our only choice is to be like that in that German cartoon. Keep on your own line and just accept the fact that the winds may blow right and left. So now we had this larger discussion question. Two things. We asked you to talk about Mao Zedong's speech that launched the 100 Flowers campaign, and then also some about Liu Binyan's reflections on this 30 years later. Adam, could you sort of sum up? We had a lot of responses on this. Is there a theme that runs through all these responses, would you say?
Yeah, I think a lot of people point out that within the Mao speech itself, there are many contradictions, and it is very obscure, it's very opaque in some sense, that it's difficult to pin down what is the political line, the party line here. So it's very easy to make errors. Many people said that ultimately Mao was instituting a reign of terror, of control.
Rachel Zah says that, right? It's a reign of terror, right? In some sense, Elva 01 refers to George Orwell's Animal Farm.
Right. There's many references. CTAN also references Orwellian doublespeak, referring to how this document's set up.
What does doublespeak mean?
Doublespeak is you're saying one thing, but it also has an opposite meaning.
The opposite meaning, right? And so Mao Zedong says, let the flowers bloom, but if any of you turn out to be weeds, I'm going to cut you down, sort of thing.
Right. But ultimately, many people agreed that Mao was not truly looking for criticism of the party, which I don't necessarily completely agree with. I think Mao wanted specific types of criticism, that he had a particular agenda that he wanted to promote, that he wanted to push for further progressive reforms, and he needed the criticism of the people to attack the bureaucracy.
Yeah, I think that CTAN's comments on this were perceptive as well, recognizing the need that Mao Zedong did see a need for ideological foundations. Zimora has been reading a biography of Mao that's banned in China, I'm afraid, but it makes the point that he was not a naive person.
No.
And I think that's right. He realized the campaign, as she says, had run out of control. He sees the Eastern European dangers there and reacted in a way that he knew best, repression and terror, right? And Mao Zedong had been willing to use repression and terror against his enemies ever since the 1940s, 30s and 40s. So.
And very importantly, he also kept people guessing. Not everyone doesn't know exactly what the chairman's thinking. He's a political mastermind, and he manipulates people very well. Everyone's trying to work to make him happy, to, you know, satisfy him. But the problem is they don't know what that is. They don't know what to do to do that.
You know, Hamish M. Cites Fairbank and Goldman's history of China with Mao thought that only 3% of this supposedly 5 million intellectuals were hostile to his version. Yeah, I guess he got a surprise during this. And so he falls back on, as Hamish points out, on what Lucian Pai has called the logic of conversion, of coercion. Sorry, Lucian Pai was a political scientist at MIT who actually I think was born in China and grew up there. He's now passed away, but a very fine man. Very fine man. So one of the questions I have is, you know, Rung Zhang, for example, says that she thought that Mao was setting a trap from the very start. She doesn't grant him any benefit of the doubt, setting a trap for people. But I wonder, was he setting a trap?
A lot of historians have interpreted it that way, although I tend to disagree. Yeah. I think that if you look at the development of history at the time, you went, as I just mentioned, you went through the socialist high tide, a period of collectivization. There was extreme resistance to this, though. And Mao was getting a lot of resistance from within the party. And as I said, he wanted to push his political agendas further, but he needed criticism. He needed popular support against the bureaucracy in order to be able to push his vision further. And so I think that's why he launched it. I don't think he necessarily launched it with the intention of mass persecution.
Okay. WLAV says, is struck by, sort of in the beginning, the reasonableness of the first part of the text, and the later part gets in. Well, he says, you know, if we have too much, we'd simply take away their freedom of speech. It sort of chills one, he said. But then he makes the point, and this is, I think, is really worth discussing. He should have known, WLAB says, once you're in power, you're no longer revolutionary. But in fact, it strikes me that that's really a good insight into Mao, that when he was in power, he kept wanting to be a revolutionary. It never stopped, right? And he kept trying to make revolution.
He did. I mean, it's very interesting, the revolution, especially the Cultural Revolution, which we'll learn about very soon with Professor McFarquhar. What was very unique about it was a revolution supported by the leader against the party itself, which is sort of unique, I would have to imagine, in modern history, that you have a leader telling the people to make revolution against the party
that supports him, right? P.C. Zhang, our old friend, talks about the problem of not having criteria by which to know who's a wrecker, who's a counter-revolutionary, or who's a member of the people. But ultimately, if you went against Mao, you became a counter-revolutionary, it seems, as he says.
It's very interesting. In 1959, Mao gave this speech, and he argued that he wanted to replace common law and criminal law with politics.
Interesting.
He said that he wanted to have 4 conferences a year, and what was said in those conferences and the edicts that were passed through those conferences, that would be what governed the nation. So politics was to rule, not law.
So it's you know, Adam, that really sounds like an emperor. Because the way the imperial system worked was that people would send up memorials to the throne and make proposals. There'd be a discussion at court. And then the emperor would say, okay, that's it. And issue an edict saying, follow this. Oken Iruman. Notice that the section that we read of the speech doesn't talk about the party or bureaucracy. And that strikes me as an insight, too, that Mao Zedong has notion that he can directly relate to people and to intellectuals.
Right.
FBT.
Yeah. Ultimately, the 100 Flowers campaign was used in 2 different ways. 1, he was able to weed out opponents. And 2, he was able to give the semblance of openness to those who were able to criticize for things that he wanted to have criticized.
Doug Ma, who we've heard from before, makes the comment that Mao bases his approach to the question of ideological unity on political foundations. That the crucial sentence seems to me to be a scientific truth, Marxism fears no criticism. And so that raises the point, does Mao believe in Marxism? Does he have faith in it or not? And I think Doug Ma thinks Mao is cynical. Mao doesn't believe it. I don't know.
I think it's difficult to argue.
I don't know. Doug, I think I'm more inclined to say that that Mao may have believed it.
I think he did believe Marxism was a scientific truth, although I think he did disagree on many fundamental issues with, say, Leninism and the way in which Marxism should be carried out.
I think the problem is he may have believed in Marxism, but he also believed in himself.
Yeah, I think he believed in himself first, yes. Ian Davies' comment was that Mao thought that people by this time had already been sufficiently revolutionized. They had been made into revolutionary proletariat, that their ideology had been changed and reshaped by this new socialist order. And as such, their criticisms of the party would be the kinds of criticisms he wanted.
It would be useful.
Yeah,
What's
exactly.
called constructive criticism.
Constructive criticism along the party line.
Yeah.
But what he found was, no, in fact, people were not.
And so that's, I think, what leads David Chow to sort of say that, well, what it really was about was luring the snakes from their holes, right, to punish them. But David makes an interesting point, I think, that from here, from this campaign to the Great Leap Forward, to the Cultural Revolution, it's a kind of a progression, right, of ideological formation that Mao was doing. Finally, I think we should note that Teo Hua Kok has given a paragraph-by-paragraph reading of this.
Right.
And it does strike me that this is always a good idea in reading, to really analyze it closely and to work sort of paragraph by paragraph. And so we recommend her or his reading to you. And we'll see you next week.
Oh yeah, I have to mention, look at this beautiful tie.
Oh, you like my tie? Yeah. Yes. Well, I want to thank our ChinaX learners for their devotion to our course, but also for a really great tie. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Bye.